Wominjeka, you are invited into this space for the Uniting Church National History webinar on history, truth-telling, and the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I'll begin by acknowledging that we're all situated today on many lands and waters that have never been ceded to the invading powers who took them by force and whose inhabitants encountered Christ through law and ceremony in ancient times. We pay our respect to the custodians of those lands, to their elders past and present, and to the First Nations people who are participating in this webinar tonight. I'm keenly aware that as a person descended from colonial settlers, I have benefited from the dislocation and removal of First Nations people from their lands and waters. I wish to renew my commitment to reconciliation and justice for the Indigenous people from whom I have learned so much. And I celebrate the recent renewing of the covenant between the Uniting Church and the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress. In particular, I am coming to you from the land of the River Red Gums in the beautiful Plenty Valley on Wurundjeri country in Naarm, the place we now call Melbourne. My name is Glenn O'Brien and I am Chair of the Uniting Church National History Society. I now offer a short prayer. God of creation and grace, only the outskirts of whose deep wonder and mystery have been revealed in the images captured by the James Webb Telescope. Guide us by your Spirit to a deeper understanding so that our past and future together may be caught up in the fullness of all things in Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. I wish to welcome all our panelists, Nathan Tyson, Emily Hayes, Laura Rademacher, and Tim Matten-Johnson, and I will introduce each one more fully when it comes their time to speak. I'd also particularly recognise the Reverend Sharon Hollis, who is President of the Uniting Church and the patron of our society and is present with us tonight. This webinar is co-sponsored by the University of Divinity and its School of Indigenous Studies. The chair of the committee of the School for Indigenous Studies is the Reverend Auntie Jean Turpie Johnston. And the Reverend Dr. Gary Deverill is a Trollaway man and a lecturer and research fellow of the school. And I'm inviting Gary now to bring a short word of greeting on behalf of the school.
Thank you, Glenn. I also acknowledge ancestors and elders who have cared for this country. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people as well. It's a terrific thing to get together and talk about the possibilities that the Uluru Statement brings, and to discuss the advantages and the disadvantages of following it more literally or metaphorically. I hope that'll be part of our discussions. But we in the School of Indigenous Studies, as we set out to I suppose, indigenize and decolonize the sort of normal way of doing theology in Australia, are very supportive of any such discussions. So I wish you all well, and I hope you have a terrific conversation this evening. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you very much, Gary. So just a bit of an idea of how tonight will proceed. Each of our speakers will speak for up to 15 minutes. And after all four have spoken, we will invite questions, and we have two ways of submitting those questions. You can use the Q&A function, or you can put your questions into the comment area, and I will do my best to field those questions. If you could indicate to whom you are addressing your question, or whether it's a question for the whole group, that would be helpful. And we hope to have about half an hour available to us for questions at the end or in the latter part of our seminar. So let me introduce our first speaker. Nathan Tyson is an A1 Gomeroi man and manager of First Peoples Strategy and Engagement in the New South Wales ACT Synod of the Uniting Church. We're grateful for your participation, Nathan, and we hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Glenn and Gary, for your introductions and welcome. I too would like to just acknowledge that I'm tonight on the land of the Darug people in Western Sydney, and I pay my respects to elders, cultural custodians, knowledge holders and community leaders of the Darug Nation. I also offer my respects to any and all First Nations people who may be online tonight. Great to have you here, and I would encourage you to share your thoughts or questions for the Q&A later in the webinar. So yeah, I'm Nathan Tyson. I work with the Synod of New South Wales and the ACT. I'd just like to say that the opinions that I express tonight are my own opinions. They're not necessarily endorsed by the Synod or the Uniting Church or anyone else, but hopefully they're fairly reasonable and palatable. And I suppose I acknowledge at the outset that, as there should be, there's a wide diversity of opinions and perspectives across Aboriginal people and communities, including in relation to the various elements of the Statement from the Heart. And I acknowledge at the outset that there are some people who are not supportive necessarily of the Statement from the Heart, or who are legitimately wary and or sceptical about the motives behind the statement. There are also people, for example, who are waiting for greater clarification as to exactly what the government intends to do to address the broad aspirations of the statement. There's also, I suppose, a broad diversity around opinions about what priority the different elements of the Statement from the Heart should have. So whether, you know, the voice should be the first priority, or treaty should be first priority, or Truth-Telling Commission should be first priority. So I acknowledge that there is diversity of opinion around that as well. And the reality is, I think that in such a complex and also still being worked through process, there's likely to be lots of different opinions because people are still working out what's happening and where it's going and how they feel about it. So I just want to put that on the table at the outset. I'll start off just very quickly by talking about a couple of Uniting Church historical statements that I think sort of help frame why the church, for example, might have an interest in this space. And the first one is the 1994 Covenant Statement that was made by the then president to the UAICC. And I've just got a couple of paragraphs from that I'll read. I'll start off. So we recognise, as was declared in the Assembly's 1988 Statement to the Nation, that the Australian people and this church continue to benefit from the injustices done to your people over the past 2 centuries. We believe it is right for the Uniting Church to make reparations to you for land taken from your people and used by the churches which became part of this church. We want to bring discrimination to an end so that your people are no longer jailed in disproportionate numbers, and so that equal housing, health, education and employment opportunities are available for your people as for ours. To that end, we commit ourselves to work with you, that being the UAICC, towards national and state policy changes. We commit ourselves to build understanding between your people and ours in every locality, and to build relationships which respect the right of your people to self-determination in the church and in the wider society. And I particularly note that respecting the right to self-determination, because I think that's key in all of this stuff. And just quickly, in the revised preamble, the UCA's revised preamble, and Gary might want to talk about that later, but anyway, in the revised preamble, it's a fairly long preamble, but a couple of passages from that preamble I'll mention are: the Uniting Churches were largely silent as the dominant culture of Australia constructed and propagated a distorted version of history that denied this land was occupied, utilised, cultivated and harvested by these first peoples, who also had complex systems of trade and interrelationships. As a result of this denial, relationships were broken and the very integrity of the gospel proclaimed by the churches was diminished. From the beginning of colonisation, the first peoples challenged their dispossession and the denial of their proper place in this land. In time, this was taken up in the community, in the courts, in the parliaments, in the way history was recorded and told, and in the Uniting Church in Australia. So yeah, I just offer those few passages just to sort of help provide background of what, why is the church even interested in this space? The Uniting Church has been interested in building relationships and supporting First Peoples for some decades. So, okay, so Meg, if you want to just pop up the first slide, the Article 19 slide. So thank you, Meg. In my travels and reading about the Statement from the Heart and various other things, and I apologise if I need to, that I'm also a lawyer by trade, so I can't help sometimes look at these things. I came across, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, of which the Australian government became a signatory in 2009. And Article 19 really jumped out at me, particularly in relation to the voice element of the Statement from the Heart. So Article 19 says, states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representatives, institutions, in order to obtain their free, prior and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. Leave that up there for a second, Meg, but you can probably pull it down in a minute or two. So that I'll talk a bit more about that particular article in a little while. In 2019, the Synod of New South Wales and the ACT endorsed what was called the Makarrata proposal, which was put forward by Reverend Dr. Amelia Coe Butler and Reverend Dr. John Squires. And this proposal encouraged members of the church, particularly the Synod, to engage with the Statement from the Heart and to consider First Peoples' calls for voice treaty truth. So the Synod supports, in principle, the Statement from the Heart, as it offers the opportunity for the Australian government to deliver significant positive outcomes for Australia's First Peoples and the Australian nation. While the Statement from the Heart has the potential to achieve outcomes for First Peoples, we do await more detail from the government in terms of the things such as what the voice mechanism will actually look like, how it will be structured, how representatives will be elected or appointed, and how it will be funded. For example, I'm keenly awaiting the Australian government's response to the Indigenous Voice Co-Design Process final report, which is available on the internet if anyone wants to Google it. So, to better understand how the government intends to proceed, because at the end of the day, the Statement from the Heart is quite aspirational, but in terms of how that's going to hit the ground in practice, we're still sort of waiting to see how that might pan out. So talking about the voice particularly, first off, so the Statement from the Heart calls for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Australian Constitution. And I believe, as per Article 19, that's still up there, that it's critically important that First Peoples are able to effectively raise their perspectives, concerns and needs to inform and influence the development and implementation of legislation that will impact First Peoples and communities. I think that a mechanism enshrined in the Constitution that actually gives First Peoples a genuine and fully informed and self-determined capacity to influence the content of draft legislation or proposed legislative amendments would be a fantastic outcome. However, again, the question sort of is and remains, what exactly will the voice mechanism look like? So this diagram is taken from the Indigenous Voice Co-Design Process final report. And in talking about what the national voice might look like, in the executive summary of that report, it says, and I quote, as a result of this and through careful deliberation, the final proposal for a national voice is a 24-member model, including 5 members representing remote regions and 1 member representing a significant number of Torres Strait Islanders living on the mainland. So that's the big green box is that sort of national voice, which the proposal is a 24-member model. The report also talks about a local and regional voice, which is the big orange box. So just looking at that diagram, there's a few queries from my perspective. One, the proposal is, say, for a 24-member sort of committee, hopefully elected via that local and regional structure. The local and regional structure sort of members do go through this sort of ethics council, which on reading that report talks about things like whether people have been bankrupt, whether they've had criminal charges and various other criteria. So, who and how that ethics council sort of operates could be a challenge. I mean, if local and regional people sort of pick people they think are the best to elect them, and then the ethics council says, no, sorry, you're not good enough, that could be problematic. And also probably one of the biggest issues for discussion is around this right at the top right-hand corner. It says provides non-binding advice, both to the Australian Parliament and to the Australian government. So basically it's all this stuff to get a national voice to provide great advice to the government and to the Parliament around Aboriginal perspectives on particular issues and legislation, all of which could ultimately be sort of dealt with in terms of, look, thanks, that's great, but we're doing this anyway. I mean, we would hope that that won't be the case, but as a non-binding advice, that's a potential reality. And certainly that non-binding situation probably doesn't really meet the rights that are spoken about in Article 19 of the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. So just a few things to think about, just throwing those out there. So, yeah, one of the questions that I was thinking about as well was, you know, should First Peoples, for example, have the ability to either require redrafting of draft legislation or to be deemed exempt from the application of particular legislation, like thinking about that Article 19. And, you know, that's a very complex question because it probably moves us into, you know, people thinking about, well, does that actually amount to a veto power? And maybe it's a veto power that's in relation to particular legislation that's directly impacting First Peoples. Yeah, and then I think of the NT intervention and the legislation that underpinned that. And, you know, what would that sort of a voice have done prior to the implementation of the intervention if this stuff was already in place? Just things to think about. I'll move on to treaty because unfortunately we've got limited time, so I'm going to try and get through a fair bit. But in terms of treaty, the Statement from the Heart calls for the establishment of a Makarrata Commission to supervise the process of agreement making between governments and First Nations, for example, the establishment of treaties. As a result of, and I apologise, I'm probably preaching to the converted and telling a lot of people what they already know, but hopefully it might be of interest to some who may not understand some of this. So as a result of the unlawful use of the doctrine of terra nullius, which was in fact contrary to the fact that there were people here and also to the royal instruction from the king, which was to, you know, be amicable and form treaties with native people should they be found. The British didn't form treaties with Australia's First Peoples during the process of colonisation, as they did with New Zealand and in many other countries around the world. There's significant international precedent to guide the development and implementation of treaties with First Peoples. And in fact, Australia is the only Commonwealth country that does not have a treaty with its First Peoples. So, you know, if this was the Olympics or the Commonwealth Games, we'd be coming last, which is, you know, not great. I like to think that Australia is a pretty competitive country and maybe we can, you know, not want to be last in this one. So in reality, the process for treaty negotiation and implementation will take time, potentially 10 years or more if done properly. It will also require significant financial resourcing, both to support the consultation process and also to ensure that First Nations peoples have access to expert and independent legal advice to support them in treaty negotiations. So it will take time, it will cost money, but it is certainly very possible, and I believe we should be certainly, you know, aiming to get treaties done. In terms of truth, the Statement from the Heart explains, Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. Again, we see that self-determination theme coming through. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. So, you know, truth-telling is going to involve listening to and recording First Peoples' stories, experiences, perspectives, and ensuring that Australian history reflects First Peoples' experiences of colonisation, dispossession, and resistance against genocidal practices. So there are some international precedents in this area. For example, Canada established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that worked between 2007 and 2015 to facilitate reconciliation among former students of residential schools, their families, their communities, and all Canadians. For those who may not be aware, residential schools were very similar in a lot of ways to the forced removal of Aboriginal children in Australia that were then put into institutions. In Canada, there was this sort of residential school structure that children were pretty much forcibly taken or bullied into going to. And you know, it's a very tragic story. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into that tonight, but I encourage people to have a read about what happened in Canada. So yeah, there is an international precedent. It's been done before. I think, what have I got here? So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission spoke with over 6,500 witnesses, hosted 7 national events across Canada to educate people about the history and legacy of residential school system, and to share and honour the experiences of former students and their families. And in the end, they released a 6-volume final report, including 94 calls to action or recommendations to further reconciliation between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. So again, there's definitely sort of international precedent that Truth and Reconciliation Commission or Truth and Justice Commission is quite plausible and quite useful. So I'm sort of getting to the end, but I just thought I would flag that the Synod of Victoria and Tasmania has got a great resource, the Statement from the Heart Study Guide. There is a link there, which you probably won't better write down that quickly, but certainly if you Google Synod of Victoria and Tasmania Statement from the Heart Study Guide, you will find it. Similarly, the Anglican Board of Mission has produced a Statement from the Heart learning resource called A Voice in the Wilderness, Listening to the Statement from the Heart. The Assembly, the Uniting Church in Australia Assembly website also has some really great resources available via the Living the Covenant Locally site. And the Synod of New South Wales and the ACT's Walking Together Action Plan is also available on our Synod's website. And our Synod also has broadly a site called First Nations Resources. So if you Google First Nations Resources UCA, you'll get a link to that website, and there's a whole range of resources on there. So thank you for the chance to do a plug. So in summary, and to conclude, the Statement from the Heart and its aspirations of voice, treaty and truth offer the nation the opportunity to take practical steps to address historical legacies arising from the dispossession, oppression and the attempted genocide of Australia's First Peoples. The Statement from the Heart provides the Australian government and this nation with the opportunity to genuinely hear and respond to the voices of First Peoples, the opportunity to implement agreements that will provide acknowledgement of past wrongdoings and redress for the significant grief and trauma experienced by First Peoples, and the opportunity to ensure future generations of Australians are able to understand the truth about the colonial history of this country. So we just need to wait and see exactly what the Australian government is willing to do to make the most of this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathan, for that extremely helpful information and background. Participants might wish to take note of questions that they have arising from Nathan's presentation. Keep them in reserve, however, until we open up the Q&A for discussion. So we now move to our second speaker, the Reverend Emily Hayes, who is a Uniting Church Minister of the Word at John Flynn Memorial Church on the land of the Arrernte people in Alice Springs in the Northern Territory. So Emily, we hand over to you for your presentation.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Emily and I am the minister at the Alice Springs Uniting Church. I've only been in this role for 10 months, but I did work at the church for the previous 5 years during my formation. But I have lived here in Alice Springs in Bantua on the lands of the Arrernte people for almost 14 years. And I too acknowledge them as the traditional owners of this land on behalf of our Creator. And I previously worked in Indigenous education and at the Alice Springs Women's Shelter alongside women experiencing domestic violence. I think the Uluru Statement is one of the most ingenious, gracious, generous and practical documents that I have read in this space. And it's one of the most beautifully constructed pieces of literature that I think has come out of Australia. And unsurprisingly to me, it came from First Nations people. As Nathan said, the statement does not have universal support from all Aboriginal people. No document from any people group does. People are not monolithic. But here, mining companies, government organisations, individual researchers, etc., who want Aboriginal backing for something and don't find it in community consultation will find someone with a different opinion. of course, but they will use that one voice to enable them to do exactly what they wanted to do in the first place. And this is the very reason I think the voice is needed. And the high level of support for it after a very thorough process, I think, is unique. But again, as Nathan has pointed out, First Nations people do have a lot of work to do in how it will look. But I see Indigenous disadvantage and disempowerment here in my town daily, and the prompt dismissal of the statement's generous invitation and proposals was deeply troubling to me and to many others who have longed to walk alongside Aboriginal people in a movement for a better future. So since 2017, I have wondered, is there a way that I could personally respond to the statement? And in 2021, I read Elaine Enns and Ched Meyer's book, Healing Haunted Histories, which claims to tackle the oldest and deepest injustices on the North American continent. These violations inhabit every section of settler and Indigenous world, past and present, and have generated wounds that are inextricably woven into the fabric of our personal and political lives. And I believe this is also true for Australia. And their book outlines a discipleship of decolonisation, which invites settlers like me to investigate the histories of our families and communities, exploring where they came from and why, the difficulties that they encountered and the benefits that they received, and whose land they came onto and how their arrival impacted those people. I imagine in most people's ancestry, there will be both inspiring and really painful stories. But it's important to do this because our history has very real impacts today, impacts that play out in my town daily. As a person of privilege amongst this, I need to acknowledge that the many benefits I have received have come at a great cost to Aboriginal people. And it's important to do this because Aboriginal people have asked us to. It is a way of standing in solidarity with them who should not have to carry the burden of truth-telling on their own. It is a way non-Indigenous people can do our work and tell our stories without colonising spaces that Aboriginal people are in and telling stories that are theirs to tell. In a background briefing episode called The Ghosts Are Not Silent, Noongar writer Claire Coleman says, "I think everyone should look into the history of their own family. Aboriginal people do it all the time. We look into our histories to try and find out what happened to us. And I don't think it's too much to expect that colonisers do the same thing, look into and make the effort to find out what's in their past." Reverend Dr. Denise Champion says colonisation affects the whole population, black and white. Truth is a way forward for us all. Jesus dared to suggest that it will set us free. And so for a master's thesis, I began to do some research on one of my spiritual ancestors, the Reverend John Flynn. The Alice Springs Uniting Church meets in the John Flynn Memorial Uniting Church building, built in 1956 as a memorial to Flynn. It's a well-known heritage-listed building, and as the place I was called, formed, and ordained for ministry, this church has shaped who I am, and I feel a great commitment to its story and the legacy of its namesake. Flynn was born in 1880 and died in 1951. He was a man of great faith and innovation, dedicated to making the outback safer and less lonely for inland settlers. He was pivotal to the founding of the Royal Flying Doctor Service and the Australian Inland Mission, now Frontier Services. He took on the role as superintendent of the AIM in 1912 and stayed in the role for 39 years. During that time, the AIM placed hospitals and nurses and patrol padres throughout remote Australia, and this legacy continues. The RFDS now provides 24/7 emergency care across 80% of Australia, which includes many Aboriginal communities. Frontier Services currently has 14 bush chaplains, providing pastoral and practical support to people doing it tough across rural and remote Australia. I share an office with one of them, Benjamin Quillam. He's a truly humble man and dedicated to all people in Central Australia. Another is Julia Lennon, an Anangu woman from Oodnadatta, and she's one of the most extraordinary Christian leaders that I have met, and their work is vital. My own life here is only possible because of the work of people like Flynn in opening up this country. But now to try to hold this rich legacy alongside what it meant for First Nations people. The opening up of this country for white people and their cattle meant the desecration of waterholes, food sources, and sacred sites needed for survival and the transfer of culture and ancient knowledge, and it forced them off their ancestral lands. The University of Newcastle's colonial massacres map shows 21 massacres occurred across the Northern Territory, Northern WA, and Queensland during Flynn's time as superintendent of the AIM. 1910 also marked the beginning of the stolen generations. From this time to the 1970s, anywhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 10 Aboriginal children were removed from their families. Most of these children were the so-called half-caste children deserted by their white fathers, the living evidence of exploitation of Aboriginal women across the frontier. In the shocking words of Henry Reynolds, Aboriginal women were preyed upon by any and every white man whose whim it was to have a piece of black velvet wherever and whenever they pleased. Flynn might have been creating a mantle of safety for white settlers, but it seems their growing presence was not making Aboriginal people safer. Throughout this time, Flynn published the Engaging Inland magazine, which gave voice to many of the issues that were facing the outback, but it was silent on all this, something that the preamble acknowledges, as Nathan pointed out. While Flynn did occasionally write about Aboriginal people with compassion, such as when he said, their situation was not what one would like to see, not a single edition of the Inlander mentions the massacres or the exploitation of Aboriginal women and the forced removal of their children. In fact, he claims, among the white residents, there's a general feeling of kindliness towards the natives. My research has also come across various accusations levelled against Flynn of racism. Most famously, Dr. Charles Duguid claimed Flynn told him, "You are only wasting your time among so many damned dirty niggers." We can never know for sure whether Flynn actually made this comment, but in any case, I believe racism is systematic. It exists because our society is structured in a way that privileges white people over people of colour. Thus, all of us who have benefited from this system are racist, including me, even if our racism is unconscious. Much has been written defending Flynn's legacy with Aboriginal people, most significantly a 1972 article written in response to the accusations of racism, titled "About Our Aborigines and What Flynn of the Inland Really Said." This article takes various quotes from Flynn, such as, "It should be quite unnecessary at this late day for us to point out that the black man, as a member of the human family, has a right to increasing opportunities of self-development. We, who so cheerfully sent a cheque for £10,000 to Belgium to help a people pushed out by their own inheritance, by foreigners, surely we must just as cheerfully do something for those whom we clean-handed have dispossessed." However, it admits that Flynn wrote in the same article on the very next page, "When we put chains around the necks of those blacks, we did a noble thing in one sense. We admitted our responsibility to lead the black man for evil practices into things that are good and true. But we do so easily tire of being noble, and once he has served his time for stoushing a poor Chinaman, we turn the black man adrift to make his way unaided to virtue or sink again to evil, whichever he pleases, as fast as he cares." Alongside his moments of insight and compassion are these moments of disregard for the humanity of Aboriginal people. I'm still trying to figure out what to make of all this. I do not want to justify it, but I'm acutely aware of the pitfalls in judging people of the past with present knowledge and values. But there were white people at the same time. such as Charles Dogood, deeply concerned about the effects of white settlement on Indigenous people. Dr. Dogood was an influential leader in the Presbyterian Church as well. While Flynn was campaigning for settlers in Central Australia, Dogood was campaigning for the protection of Aboriginal people and their culture. He successfully lobbied for the 1937 establishment of Ernabella Mission to provide a buffer between the Pitjantjatjara people and the white settlers exploiting them. He believed this mission should be founded on the principle of freedom, saying there was to be no compulsion nor imposition of our way of life on the Aborigines, nor deliberate interference with tribal customs. And it was. In a speech he made to the General Assembly in 1936, he described Aboriginal people as not only most ancient, but endowed with remarkable and attractive qualities of mental and moral character. He went on, there were no beasts of burden in Australia, no animals that could supply milk for human use, and no fruits or vegetables or grain that could be cultivated for human consumption. And yet these people grew and multiplied and were healthy and happy until the white man came along. The signal mistake was made that is still being made in general principle. We never sought their cooperation. His words convict us even in this time. But while he was always respectful of the Pitjantjatjara people, he also never spoke of their leadership in the beginning of the mission either. He was the hero of his story. I believe we need to look at retelling our history in a way. I believe we need to relook at our telling of history in the way that in giving such prominence to stories like Flynn's and Dogood's, it has silenced Aboriginal people's stories. Still thinking about how this changes the way we tell our history, we need to add Indigenous stories back in. We need to describe places from their point of view instead of the current practice of dating them from when white fellas discovered them or did something on them. For example, the town of Mollyagul, which advertises itself as the place of Flynn's birth, is also the lands of the Dja Wurrung clan, who say, for us, Djantjak country is more than just a landscape. It's more than what is visible to the eye. It is a living entity which holds the stories of creations and histories that cannot be erased. It's not easy to hold our great respect for someone with the realities of their failings, but we do in fact do it all the time with the people around us and ourselves. And our biblical narrative is filled with flawed heroes, Abraham, Sarah and Hagar, Jacob, Rachel and Leah, David, Peter, Martha and Paul. And God is able to use these people for his good purposes with all their human frailty and, dare I say it, sin. I am not a historian. I am a local minister. But for me, the work of truth-telling about history is profoundly theological. As Enns and Myers say, truth-telling is necessary for all Christians who would follow a Jesus who was executed by a colonial state, reckon with the long and lamentable history of colonising Christendom, and care about a church, care about a future for the church as a house for all people. For my church community, it is important to us to discern how we might better relate to our Aboriginal church members, their people, and to this land. I will finish with a quote of great insight from Flynn himself, from the 1927 Inlander. We Australians who lightheartedly for 4 generations have been reading to Aborigines the move-aside clause will be called upon to render an account of our stewardship. God only knows how soon. I think that time has come. It is both a challenging time and a time of great hope. A time to, in the words of the Uluru Statement, walk together in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. Amen.
Thank you so much, Emily, for a very impressive, insightful, and heartbreaking presentation. I think you have served us well in addressing the truth-telling aspect of our webinar theme. So thank you so much. I'm sure there will be much interesting discussion later on in the webinar. For now, we turn to Dr. Laura Rademacher, who is an historian at Australian National University on Ngunnawal country. Her book, Found in Translation, Many Meanings on a North Australian Mission, was awarded the 2020 Hancock Prize. She's also the editor of the Journal of Religious History. Laura, it's wonderful to have you, and we now turn to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Glenn, and thanks for organising tonight. It's been fascinating already. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I'm zooming to you from unceded Ngunnawal country, and so firstly I'd like to acknowledge their elders and pay my respects, and to acknowledge all the First Nations people here. I'd really especially value your comments afterwards in the chat. As Glenn said, I'm an historian from ANU. My work focuses on the history of Christian missions, and I've spent a lot of time in the Northern Territory doing oral history. I'm currently co-writing a book with a Tiwi woman, Mavis Keranawa, about the history of the Tiwi Islands and its mission. And I'm also working on a project about the end of the missions and self-determination in the Northern Territory in the 1970s and 80s. I'm part of the Anglican Church myself, and it was actually, I guess, wanting to come to terms with the involvement of my own church and of non-Indigenous Christians who are much like me in the atrocity of the stolen generations. That's what led me to want to understand mission history in the first place. And so here I am today. But to the Uluru Statement, the first thing that struck me about the Uluru Statement is, as Emily also said, it's stunning generosity to those of us who are settlers on First Nations land. Without shying away from the injustices of the past, it's an invitation to settlers to be received as guests on First Nations country. Some would say that settler Australia is not worthy of the radical generosity extended by the Uluru Statement, that our past record shows that we don't have the capacity to respond appropriately. And my understanding is that this is one of the reasons why not all First Nations people support the Uluru Statement. And to be honest, I would say that's for good reason. The way the statement was dismissed out of hand and even misrepresented by governments that received it in 2017 is indicative of the contempt that settler Australia has shown for the generosity and the hospitality of First Nations people. I hope in my work as a non-Indigenous historian that I might respond appropriately to the invitation that it extends, that is to be a good guest on First Nations land. The next thing I noticed about the Uluru Statement after its spirit of generosity is just how grounded in history it is. You'll know it states, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. It goes on. How could it be otherwise that people possessed a land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? It then later on links the triumphs of the 1967 referendum to the invitation that it extends to address this unfinished business half a century later in 2017, and it calls for a Makarrata Commission for truth-telling about history. Now, this is where historians like me are tempted to get really excited. As some have warned, does all this truth-telling business mean that academic historians win the jackpot? Will it mean endless employment opportunities and contracts for non-Indigenous historians like me as we pursue more and more truth-telling? And some First Nations people have warned that unless done properly, a Makarrata Commission could be a junket for historians without justice for First Nations people. Others have warned that if done first, truth-telling might be a stalling strategy. It could be a barrier to the First Nations voice and to constitutional change. Truth-telling could be an exercise in kicking the can down the road. It's a process that's never complete, nor should it ever be considered over and done with. There's always more to learn, there's more perspectives to incorporate. But when you think of things like the reconciliation movement of the 1990s, we learned so much about stolen children, but we still don't have a treaty. The truth is, we actually already know enough about the history of invasion and dispossession in this continent to know that there needs to be action now. We don't need an inquiry to demonstrate this. And truth-telling is vital and it must proceed. I support the Makarrata Commission, don't hear me saying anything against that, but it can't be used to delay action on the voice or on treaty, would be my view. But back to the academic historians, when you look closely at the statement, you'll notice that it has a larger vision of history and of truth-telling than the kinds of work that academic historians like me do in universities. It encompasses that kind of work, and that work is important. Notice that it grounds its claim in the 1967 referendum, linking it to 2017. And this is a recognition of the power of the linear chronological histories that historians write, that they shape public discourse, that they make claims of the settler nation. Indeed, it's kind of a way of turning settler Australia's own historical traditions against it and making claims of the nation. And that kind of history is useful and powerful and important. But you'll notice that there's also a broader understanding of the past and of First Nations claims on view. You'll see First Nations sovereignty is grounded in different kinds of time, times that flow at different rhythms. There's the time of creation, the time of time immemorial, and the time of science, 60,000 years, all of which confirm First Nations sovereignty according to their own logics. And this is the challenge for historians, because until recently, academics like me deemed the pasts of Australian Indigenous people didn't really count as history. These pasts were of some other quality. They were myth, they were memory. They weren't the kind of past that determined world events and shaped the future like history proper does. Now, it's not okay anymore to say that Australian history began in 1788. Most people would acknowledge that. But our academic disciplines are still shaped around the logic that First Nations pasts are not really history, and that these other times, different in their quality and quantity, like outlined in the Uluru Statement, are not really relevant to our work. It's embedded in the distinctions between history and archaeology. It might seem strange today for some people's past to be only myth or memory, and other pasts to have the dignity of being called history. But back in the 19th century, when the academic disciplines that we know today were taking their shape, the existence of written literacies, of writing, became the dividing line between whose past was studied by which academic experts. Historians took writing, and archaeologists took the rest. In a way, this division made sense from the perspective of European scholars. The study of written records in the archive needs one type of expertise, and the study of material culture needs another. The written record was the domain of historians, and whatever came before writing fell to archaeologists. Historians called their times history. Archaeologists, except for historical archaeologists who applied archaeological methods to contexts and cultures which have written archives, archaeologists studied prehistory. Now, prehistory covered the entire past of the human species until Mesopotamians started writing things down about 5,000 years ago. And after that, it got complicated, and different peoples in different parts of the world started using written literacies or not at various times. But this implicitly meant that for many peoples, history began when European colonizers invaded their lands and shores, bringing their writing with them. And so cultures that used literacies other than written script to know their pasts, oral traditions, art, song, dance, monuments, and in Australia, even country itself, were mistakenly deemed not to have history at all. But in reality, it was simply that the European historians didn't know how to interpret them. Historians and archaeologists today know about these problems, and lots of scholars in both disciplines are working hard to try and unpick the racist assumptions and the colonial heritage at the core of our disciplines. And Indigenous historians and archaeologists themselves are leading this charge. But they are old habits. For archaeologists working in settler colonial contexts like Australia, the historical period is more or less interchangeable with the colonial or contact period. History still often starts and is defined by the presence of settlers. Historians, meanwhile, have probably paid less attention to the racist and colonial assumptions that mark out our discipline, perhaps a little bit oblivious to the debates going down the corridor in archaeology. But historians have been rethinking their archive and turning to oral and Indigenous knowledges as sources of history. Historians are starting to grasp that all peoples have histories and that these are known, understood, and shared in rich and manifold ways. They're increasingly accepting that there are ways of knowing the past which are beyond the traditional colonial archive. There are other kinds of archives, other houses of memory, beyond the repositories of written documents built by colonial authorities. Now, it's First Nations people themselves that hold these knowledges, who know how to read these archives. And I see the Uluru Statement calling for a broader understanding of what history might be, how it can be known, so that these knowledges are recognised as truth-telling that they are. This means that oral history, family history, but also art and dance and song and rock art and country itself are part of history, of telling the truth about history. And it also means rethinking authority and why some histories are considered reliable and others are not. It means accommodating multiple voices, and it means even recognizing that some stories are better not told, at least not for now. Or perhaps these stories need to wait to be told by the right person, perhaps face to face and on country. I'm really fascinated by the way the Uluru Statement seamlessly moves across different understandings and experiences of time itself. It shows how First Nations people have found ways to engage with time and history as understood and communicated by settlers, the sort of linear history time frame that non-Indigenous people are familiar with, without conceding that this kind of time and this kind of knowing history is the only way of knowing and experiencing time. If you look back at the statement, you'll see how it relativizes scientific datings based in linear time alongside First Nations knowledge, which is from the creation. In the Uluru Statement, First Nations people have found ways to translate their claims, making it comprehensible to the times and the expectations of settler Australia. And there's that spirit of generosity again. But there's also a continued assertion of the experiences and knowledges of a different kind of time and different knowledges of histories beyond the linear settler times that academic historians in universities are used to telling. So rather than truth-telling being a boon for academic historians to take control of the process and probably do very well out of, I think the truth-telling that the Uluru Statement asks us to consider, it expands our visions of history. It includes the familiar chronologies, 1967 and all that, but it takes us far beyond this kind of truth-telling. And historians need to learn to listen to other modes of telling history, other ways of relating to the past, where the past and the present can interpenetrate, where past beings can be living presences, where there are other sources of historical truth and knowledge. And I think our histories might become all the richer for appreciating what truth-telling about the past might become in all of its fullness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for another outstanding presentation. I thought that you addressed the history theme of our webinar in quite a masterful way. So thank you so much for that extremely helpful address. We turn now to our final speaker, Reverend Tim Matten-Johnson, Panina man, currently living on Murramina country in Kutalena, Tasmania. He is a retired former Congress Minister, Uniting Aboriginal Islander and Christian Congress Minister. And we're very grateful, Tim, that you've stepped in to replace Reverend Mark Kickett, Interim Chair of Congress, when at late notice, Mark became unavailable to speak. So Tim, we hand over to you.
Thank you for that welcome. And I also acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and the people of the land that we are all gathered on in different kinds of ways. We're all on country somewhere. I wasn't too sure about how to start this, my comments. I'm a theologian, so I tend to think about things, especially in theological language, perhaps a bit more than history, although I have studied some history at times in the past. I was thinking about the passage about sovereignty and that's never been ceded or extinguished. The statement there in the heart that they say sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between land or Mother Nature and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It's never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. That's a theological statement more so than a piece of law, I suspect, because you can't read that without thinking about the nature of the relationship with country. It's deep in terms of the time, as Laura was talking about, that deep time, that more multifaceted sense of time. It's deep in that way, but it is also the basis of how the civilization worked. For Aboriginal people, the relationship that they had with country was the most significant thing that sustained them in their living, in their faith and in their hope, all of these theological kind of words. And so I couldn't help but, in my thinking about it, there's a sense in which it can't be ceded. It can't disappear. Well, there's one Aboriginal person and there's one piece of country. It cannot be ceded. And so the idea, the thinking about sovereignty is not the same as it is in international law, where you can cede sovereignty when you surrender after invasion or something like that. Because to cede it would to destroy yourself as a people. That is how deep that connection is. These last few years, I've been experimenting with something called living on country in a 21st century way. I'm not quite sure where I got that name from. I'm not sure it was mine, but trying to work out how would a person who's lived and who's 6 generations back to Aboriginal days for me, in that older sense of pre-colonial times. So how would you, in this different circumstance that we find ourselves in today, live on country? How do you develop a relationship with country that informs you at multiple levels? Emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, physically. How do you do that in a very different context? One thing for sure, I'd annoy my neighbours no end if I started using fire as a management tool. I don't think I'm allowed to do that. But also, though, there are other structures within contemporary society and mainstream civilization that make it difficult to think about living on country in a 17th century way, if you like, instead of a 21st century way. But are there not some principles that still work? How does one learn to love the country you're on? It's easy to love the special places, the sacred sites, the mountains, the tall forests, pristine beaches. But how do you love the place where you live? Sometimes it's quite small. It might just be a flat in a high rise somewhere in the middle of a big city. Sometimes, like me, it was a rural residential property where you've got a bit more option, but not a great deal on half a hectare. And so what I've been experimenting with is trying to enhance the life of the country I am on, in thinking about it in terms of that, the block of land that the house is on, but also thinking about it as the whole of ecosphere Earth. So in more than one way. So I try to do things that are ecologically good things to be doing, like solar panels and double glazing and orienting the house to the sun. Most people don't bother. You give them half a hectare of land and they still orient to the boundary, wherever that happens to be pointing. They don't even think about things like passive solar gain in the winter. So that's kind of that technical side. So you start working on that. But also there's a practical side. I'm not a gardener or a horticulturalist, not professionally trained anyway, but I try to grow some of our own food and fruit and veg. I also try to plant endangered native species. I've discovered that the thing called a Moresby gum works out here, even though it's a bit beyond its normal endangered range. And the delight then is the emotional stuff that happens when one of your tree's flowers, you harvest some seed, you put it in a pot and it grows. And so I've got trees now on my property that are mums and dads to other trees that are on the property. And so trying to think about ways of learning to love country. And it's also about knowing the story of a country. One of our earlier speakers talked about, was Emily, talking about being asked to look at your family history and see where that goes in terms of the history of what happened in the country when you were living there. So I was challenged that by Aboriginal elders about 20 years ago, and that's when in my time in the archives turned up Mary Ann Coates, who's my Aboriginal ancestor. Interesting. But also turned up somebody by the name of McCoy, who could have been part of the Black Line, which was the biggest mobilisation per capita ever in Australia to try and remove all Aboriginal people from Van Diemen's Land. Wasn't very successful, but it was a very determined effort. So, hang on, that was about with the history. But also try and learn the history of the country you're on, where you live and work. You know, and go beyond even just its human history. And by human history, of course, I want to go back to 60,000 years. Don't worry about that. But also understand the geology underneath. What were some of the plants? What's some of the ecology of the place before somebody built something on it? Look for all the history of the place where you are. I remember once I was walking along a ridge on the top of the Ben Lomond Plateau, and I was trying to think about how to deal with a biblical passage talking about creation. It was a Saturday and Sunday was getting close, and I saw right in front of me an eagle's feather sticking straight out of a bush. It's a kind of Moses-like experience, because then when I stopped and looked around me, I thought to myself, I could see many things. See, up in that part of Ben Lomond, you've still got some of the grasses that are native to Tasmania rather than introduced species. And you've still, in the spring and early summer, you get mobs of the big forester kangaroos. It's one of the very few places where you can see them anymore. It's a very Aboriginal place in that sense. But also right under my feet, there were great big hexagons, the tops of dolerite columns. They get that way through glaciers making them smooth in the Ice Age time, but also they get to be there because they've been pushed up as hot rock when great big movements are happening in the Earth's crust. I was standing on the spot that was telling me a story about when Tasmania was born as the Australian continent broke free of Gondwanaland. So I've got a kind of scientific, if you like, creation story. I was thinking about biblical creation as a theological theme, as a Christian minister. And I also know many creation stories from my own people. And so three streams coming together. Wonderful kind of moment. So learn that and do it as a holistic process use your brain, think about it, academic sort of thing. Work out how you feel about the country you're on. Is it hostile? Is it friendly? Am I welcome here? Is it home? Different kind of feelings and emotions around that. And also think about it theologically as the creation of a creator God who will not fail in his purposes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that personal set of reflections that was very helpful in encouraging us to think about how we live on country in our own places and the spiritual significance of that. Very helpful. Thank you. Well, we're now going to turn to our Q&A. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, it should be the last icon to the right of your series of icons on the screen. There is a Q&A button. If you click on that Q&A, you can type your question in. Tell us whether it is addressed to a particular panelist or to all, and that will be helpful. And then I will put the question to the panelist or to the whole group. I think it's appropriate if panelists have questions of each other to participate in the conversation as well. We have gotten up to 117 participants this evening, which is fantastic, really wonderful. If you are in a group, some of you I know are in groups where there's one Zoom registration for a group of people. It'd be great if you could let us know that in the chat pod. Chat is another one of the functions in the Zoom space here. And if you can't work out the Q&A, you can always put your question in the chat area. But if you are in a group, it'd be helpful for you to tell us how many people are in your place. And that'll help us get an even more accurate sense of how many people we've engaged with tonight. Okay, I'm seeing a question. Oh, chat is currently disabled. All right. Okay, thanks, Naomi, but it's started up now. Question from David Tutty to all. How important do you see a focus on the required conversion journey of non-Indigenous peoples, particularly those from the British Isles, so that we are better able to walk with First Nations people to a better future? What might be some parts of this conversion journey? Thanks for that, David. I just opened up for anyone who would like to respond to that.
I can a little bit. Sometimes we down here often will do cultural awareness groups for different groups, training and so on. And one of the things that people sort of feel is, oh, I'm not Indigenous, I don't have a connection or whatever. Therefore, somehow, while I can listen with interest, I can't really speak or can't be changed by what I hear in some ways, don't know how. Indigenous people lived a life of lifelong learning. In other words, they didn't just pop out of the ground understanding everything about the country they were on and what to do with it. And so there are ways to learn how to think about country in a different way. I mean, you know, to stop thinking about it as property. Think about it as living ecosystem. Think about, that's why I say to people sort of every now and then stop and look and ask yourself those sorts of questions about how do I feel being here? You know, is it something that is positive? All sorts of feelings. Ask those sort of questions as though the place was alive and would answer you back. That's the sort of starting point. So I think that, yeah, that fear that I come from a culture that is so different to yours, how could I possibly learn to understand what it is for you? Don't be scared of that. That generosity that Laura was talking about. I didn't know who my people were as I was growing up, but I met some Aboriginal elders from time to time who had that generosity. and invited me to some extent into their world, whether I understood it or not. Despite all the rough stuff about dispossession, about genocide, all of that sort of stuff, there is still that generosity to welcome you into country and to make you safe.
Thank you, Tim. There is a question from Rob Turner. Would it be helpful or would it be divisive to signpost entry to individual tribal/national boundaries? For example, welcome to Mardigan country. I might ask Nathan if he'd be willing to respond to that one, the idea of signposting country.
Yeah, look, I mean, to be honest, in New South Wales, it actually happens in a lot of places. You will see signs often put up by local councils acknowledging that you're entering a particular country. So yeah, look, I think it's a wonderful thing to do. Yeah, and similar, you know, I mean, it was great to see recently on, I think it was ABC News, that was using names of country on the weather map, you know, instead of the English name. So I think any of that sort of stuff that can help to educate and pass on knowledge about country and about culture is really good. Yeah.
Thank you, Nathan. There's a question now for Emily from Alda. I have a question for Emily about doing family history. I am an immigrant from the States, where I am from a settler family. I want to do the kind of history you describe, but it is so complicated. So many people in so many places, US, Ireland, Australia, doing so many kinds of settling. How do I decide where to focus, how to train my mind on something in particular out of all the threads? Yes, the researcher's question. How do I narrow down my research question?
Yeah, and to be clear, I mean, I'm not researching my family history. I'm doing this more as a spiritual history of the community that I'm in. My own, I guess, as you know, representative of that name, I chose that. But yes, it gets complicated very quickly. I mean, the book I read, Healing Haunted Histories, their only advice is pick one and go for it and see where that takes you, and follow one line and see where it goes. That's the advice that I got from the book, and so I've sort of focused in on this one person. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Nathan.
I just wanted to very quickly respond to the question about learning, the first question. And I just wanted to say that it's important when you're learning about history of this country, particularly in that truth-telling sense, is to learn with sort of empathy and compassion. It's I think for a lot of people, there's a natural reaction to feel quite awful and bad when learning about a lot of the stuff that's gone on. And I think for some people that sort of emanates as a feeling of guilt, or they may express it as why should I feel guilty? Because they have this sense of feeling really awful about what human beings have done to other human beings, which is quite understandable. But I think it's just important to understand it's not really about guilt these days. It's because we can't go back and change what has happened, but it's acknowledging that yes, what did happen was particularly awful in most cases, and then thinking about what can we actually do from here that's constructive and positive to build relationships and to learn more about First Peoples and engagement with First Peoples, and to do that in a way that I often say to people that essentially the heavy lifting burden of building relationships between the church and First Peoples is on the church. There is no doubt about it that the heavy lifting in that space has to be done by the church. The church can't be sitting back going, well, we opened our door and we just want First Peoples to come on in. Because of our history, First Peoples are extremely wary of church and church representatives. So if we want to rebuild that relationship, the onus is on the church. Thanks.
Thanks, Nathan. Laura's responding.
Yeah, can I just jump in on that and to go back to the theme of conversion? I've learned from Tiwi history Some of the stories that they're telling about, they actually have a story about converting the church and forcing the church to come around to recognize them, which is why I really like the conversion metaphor, partly because there's an idea of traveling and turning, but also because it was the metaphor that Tiwi people talked about. They told this story about how in the late 1970s, there was a missionary priest, and he rang the bell on Sunday for Mass, and nobody turned up to Mass. And he's like, where are they? What's everybody doing? And he said, oh, they're all at a funeral ceremony across the other side of the other island. So he got in his little dinghy and went across to the funeral ceremony and knocked over all the Pukamani poles and saying, this is all pagan rubbish, this is all pagan. And the elders sort of said, oh, something's going to happen to you. And the way back, the spirit of the deceased pulled the plug in his motor, so his motor fell off the boat, and they needed to canoe out and rescue him because his boat started sinking. But from that time, the way the story is told, that this priest came to recognise that you can be Tiwi and you can be Catholic, and that he needed to embrace Tiwi culture. And he started bringing in Tiwi elements into the Mass, and really to include Tiwi people in a way that he hadn't before. He was the one that had to change. And Tiwi people are really proud of the way that they were able to get the church to begin to recognise the value of their knowledge and their culture. And they flipped the whole conversion paradigm on its head.
Mm.
Thank you. I have a question from Naomi Wolf, who is a lecturer in NAIT's Indigenous Learning Community, also part of the University of Divinity community. So Naomi asks, or firstly says, thank you to my fellow countrymen, Gary and Uncle Tim and Tyson, and Nathan Tyson. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts and also the other panelists' thoughts about churches and institutions paying lip service to Indigenous peoples, but not actually creating space for them, for example, jobs, paid ministry, etc. Thank you, Naomi.
Just very quickly, in terms of the theme, in terms of voice, treaty, truth, you know, we need to be conscious that, you know, as a broad church, if we're saying to the government that, you know, they should be supporting a voice to Parliament, we also need to ask ourselves, are our churches supporting a voice within our church, and what do those voices look like, and how are they supported?
The church is structured in such a way, historically, I suppose, where people give their money. And so if you happen to be in a particular area with a lot of people, you do very well. And if you're not, then you don't. And I think we need to just rethink about that structure altogether. You know, it seems insane to me that some churches have 5 staff members and some of us are trying to get by on, you know, half a salary, you know, and that goes for, you know, particularly that impacts the Congress ministries, you know, who don't also necessarily have people who run op shops and all the other ways that we're all trying to survive. So yes, I think a conversation needs to be had about that. And I think this new movement hopefully is, you know, people do recognise that, but how we actually do that, I think is important. Yeah.
I think one thing that I noticed historically, starting to look at the history in the 70s and 80s, that the churches, well, the missions created a kind of authenticity trap for First Nations people, saying that all this governance stuff that's really Western culture and it's not really suitable for people that, you know, are traditional and cultural and that kind of thing. And, you know, we encourage culture and stuff, but it meant that there wasn't space and opportunity for First Nations people in leadership necessarily, or it was seen to be somehow contradictory. But it's really, it's a clinging onto power, really.
There's been a question in the chat area about whether tonight's event has been recorded. Yes, it has been recorded, and it will be hosted probably on both the Assembly YouTube channel and the University of Divinity YouTube channel. So it is going to be available for others to view at a later date. Keith Suter has a question. At the 1985 Assembly, when we created the Congress, Uniting Aboriginal Islander and Christian Congress, we whites shifted the responsibility to handle Indigenous UCA matters to the Indigenous communities, whereas there was a real problem with whites. How can we re-engage more whites in this matter? For example, to reduce white apathy, antipathy towards the Uluru Statement. And I would just remind Gary, even though you weren't a presenter, you're more than welcome to weigh in on the conversation.
That's a very dangerous invitation, Glenn.
I'm fully aware of that, Gas.
Yeah, look, to me, there's a series of prior questions. One of the questions that comes up very regularly in these sorts of forums is how can white people learn more, do more, get involved more, and so on and so forth. But there's a set of prior questions about, I think, the way in which white people can learn more, do more, be engaged more. And I think that this is a set of questions and assumptions around power. To invoke a theologian, George Lindbeck, who wrote a book years ago about the nature of theology, one of the things he says is that all theological discussion, indeed all imaginative discussion of any kind, whether it be a historical imagination, a theological imagination, a legal imagination, or whatever, involves absorbing that which is seen as other into a set of assumptions that you already take for granted in order to make sense of them. And what continually happens in conversation when you're talking about conversation between the dominant culture, which is white culture in this country, and, for example, Indigenous people in this country, is there's an unspoken power imbalance there whereby everything has to be absorbed into a white imagination and a white sort of sense of power base in order for that discussion to even take place. And so I think there's a whole heap of prior questions that need to be discussed around power. And it's there in the room. It's the elephant in the room, or possibly the prehistoric mastodon in the room, whenever there's any conversation going on between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. Because what usually happens is Indigenous people find themselves at a table where the rules have already been set by white people, and you have to engage in the way that white people want you to engage, using the language that white people prefer, and bowing to all of the right authorities that white people expect you to bow to in order to be part of the discussion. And if you're not prepared to do that, if you say, for example, I'm standing on my own unceded sovereignty here, and I'm not recognising any of those authorities as relevant in this particular place in this discussion, then because the other person is more powerful, you can't have the discussion, you know? So this idea of spiritual sovereignty, which is in the Uluru Statement of the Heart, which in my view is a very, very conservative document designed to get some white people to agree, right? Is nevertheless there and is a challenge. It's kind of like the minor literature within the document, which asks the question continually, do we need white people's agreement in order to do what we have to do? And my challenge to the Indigenous people in this conversation is, let's stop ticking those boxes. Let's start standing on our own sovereignty and declaring up front what the rules are for us before we get involved in conversations where we find ourselves marginalised even against our own intentions and the intentions of the good white fellas in the room, because they're not aware of the power imbalances that they themselves are involved in as well. That's it.
Thank you. A lot of great questions, both in the chat and in the Q&A. We won't probably be able to get to all of them, but I will keep going. Brad Harris has a question. The discussion has used the figure of Makarrata to describe coming together, but Makarrata is the ceremonial spear in the thigh to expiate great wrongs, which must be corrected without clan warfare. Something can be gained by remembering the ancient way of gaining peace through atonement after great crimes. It is Yongu Mata taken from Maka, the thigh. Would anyone like to respond to that observation? It's more of an observation than a question.
And then that, again, looking historically at some of the activism around the 20s and 30s, I think fighting for Indigenous rights, people were much more able to speak of sin and atonement than they have been recently. And I guess one of the shortfalls of the reconciliation movement is that there hasn't been sin and atonement. It's aiming for reconciliation, but without justice. So in a way, the Makarrata metaphor is helpful in that it does recognise that there has been wrongdoing, and there must be some form of making up of atonement.
Thank you. Richard Lebroy asks a question for Laura. How might these new/alternative ways of doing history that you discussed be integrated into how we teach history and historical processes, thinking particularly in secondary and tertiary institutions? Richard is a chaplain at Newington College in Sydney and a history teacher. Thanks, Richard.
Look, that's a real challenge, and I'm not a high school history teacher. I guess I would recommend working with local First Nations people and being in touch with them and seeing how being on country and speaking with people who own the country can be integrated into the curriculum. I've benefited so much from working on country with people and having people tell me their own stories and their family stories, and I could only say the same for high school curriculum wherever it's possible.
Thank you. I'm just jumping over to the chat area so that I don't neglect what's going on there, because there are some good comments there. There is a question about gender dynamics, the gendered elements of First Nations culture and society. And when it comes to leadership, are there gender perspectives that need to be taken into consideration that might differ in some way from white society?
Can I jump in there again?
Yep.
Yes, there are profound differences. So generally speaking, in white Anglo culture, there are a whole heap of binaries that come into play, and one part of the binary is always the more powerful partner, and the other one is the more submissive partner, you know, and this applies to gender as well as all kinds of other kind of hierarchies. But if you read someone like Professor Mary Graham, for example, who's an Indigenous expert on traditional culture and the way that we governed ourselves and the way that we did traditional society prior to the disruptions of colonisation, she would say that in the gendered space, that men and women, and indeed other genders, because we recognised other genders in traditional societies as well, all were born into certain responsibilities by virtue of their membership of particular moieties, which were sort of groups of responsibility and law. But you know, these are all seen as equally important vocations that you inherited by virtue of your moiety, your gender, and so on. And so there was a kind of complex system of governance whereby each person had a sort of responsibility towards the others, but for certain things. And this was gendered in some ways, but in other ways it wasn't. It's very different. It's a very different way of understanding relationality and reciprocity than you tend to get in Western societies. And so obviously we've all been colonized and we've all been inducted into Western ways of doing things. And yet there is this call from the ancestors and from country, which many of us are trying to respond to kind of disrupt the colonial hierarchies, the colonial binaries, and get back to something more like this complex society, which was much more about reciprocity and knowing what your responsibility was in the context of a larger community, which included not just people, but country itself, flora and fauna, and so on. And so it's a very, very different understanding of responsibility and gender.
Thanks, Gary, very helpful. I'm going to draw the line now under the questions because we've run out of time. let me just thank all the panelists for tremendous contributions that they have made. I think it's been a very successful webinar. And thank you to those in the chat area who updated us on the number of people in their groups. So when we add that number to the registrations, we have about 135 people involved, which is really wonderful. If you like what you've heard, a short plug for the Uniting Church National History Society. Some people might think of a history society as sort of just interested in antiquarian things, old newspapers and letters, and it's all very much set in the past as a kind of arcane interest. But I hope you can see from this webinar, and 2 years ago we had a webinar on Uniting Redress that addressed the Uniting Church's response to the Royal Commission into the institutional abuse of children. I hope you can see from the themes that we're choosing that we see the role of a history society very much in terms of contemporary relevance, helping the Uniting Church and the wider church and all people of goodwill to address issues of real concern and of real significance in the present. And history can be something you just enjoy. I love looking at things in the past, and a lot of people do, and that's fine. And there's room for that pure interest in the past within our society. But we also want to see the way in which history serves the present. And so I invite you to become a member of the Uniting Church National History Society. It only costs $25, which is just a few lattes or flat whites, whatever you poison. And if you visit the Assembly website, the Uniting Church Assembly's website, you will find a page there with information about how to become a member. And we hope that you will support the work we are doing. And as this goes online, Meg has informed us that it will be within a few days, it'll be on the University of Divinity's YouTube channel. Please do share it widely with friends and family, because I think we have addressed things of real significance. I did at Anthony Albanese on Twitter and said, hey, Albo, maybe this would be helpful for the federal government. He didn't attend. Well, he might have attended. I don't know. He may have been one of the 135 participants, but Prime Minister, if you're here, thank you for at least vocalizing commitment to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Now, please do more than vocalize it and continue that conversation. Well, thank you, folks. A good night to all, and God bless.